When you're choosing a batting for your quilt, we want to find the batting that works best for you. I typically use a wool batting or a polyester batting because my quilts are folded all the time and I'm carting them back and forth to shows. So if I use a cotton batting, it is going to crease more because it's folded. If you're rolling your quilts or keeping them out flat, that's not an issue. Or, if you put them away for a while and then take them out, those crease lines are going to go away. But I'm going back and forth in suitcases all the time to events, so I don't like to use a cotton batting. But the best choice for machine quilting is a cotton batting. But if you don't like the flatness of the cotton batting, what you can do is put 2 layers of batting, a cotton on the bottom and then a wool on the top. In order to do that, I like to keep all the layers of the batting together, so I use a little bit of Misty Fuse in between the 2 battings. My favorite batting company is Quilter's Dream. So the Quilter's Dream batting, this is Quilter's Dream Select. It's a natural color, and it's a queen size, and these run $29.50. I do have these on my website. If you like the look of a polyester batting, you really like the loft of a polyester batting, then the Dream Wool might be a good choice for you. This is a little bit more expensive. It's $36 for the queen size, but you can see how fluffy it is. It's really, really fluffy as opposed to the cotton, which is a little bit more flat looking, and it's going to give a lot more puff to your applique pieces or to any areas that aren't heavily quilted. Now the last Dream cotton that I have is a Dream 80/20. So it is 20% Dream poly and 80% Dream cotton. So it's not quite as flat as the cotton. It's got all the properties of cotton, but with some of the nice properties of the polyester. So it works really, really well. This one is Select Loft, and it is a twin size, and this one runs $17 roughly. So you have lots of different options for batting. Of course, you can use your favorite batting that you like to use best. I just wanted to show you my favorite battings are the Quilter's Dream battings, and those are the only ones I carry here on my website. You can see that I have the backing for the black quilt laid out on my ironing board. I did put a seam right down the middle, and I cut off the excess blue and purple from the edges where the quilt was too wide. So now my backing is about 4 inches bigger than my quilt. I'm going to cut my batting also about 4 inches bigger than my quilt in each direction. So it's actually an 8-inch measurement difference between the quilt top and the batting and the backing. The reason why we normally use a cotton batting for machine quilting is the cotton sticks to the cotton fabric and it all stays together really nicely. Your backing, your batting, and your quilt top. Now a lot of people go with just a regular safety pin. That's what I used to use to put my quilt layers together. When you do use safety pins, you want them about a hand's width apart, 2 to 3 inches apart, and you want to keep a lot of safety pins there on the surface so that your layers don't shift around. I don't like to use the safety pins because they're always in my way when I'm sewing. So what do I use? I use scraps of Misty Fuse. I'm just going to go ahead with my scissors and cut these into little squares or rectangles. Doesn't have to be pretty. We're just going to make some little squares or rectangles with our scissors. So I'm going to cut up a whole pile of little squares and put them in my jar. And then I'm going to keep that jar next to my ironing board or my table when I'm layering my 3 layers of the quilt. When you're using the Misty Fuse method or any other method, it's best to be on a table where you can spread out the entire quilt back, and then the batting, and then the quilt top. I don't have that space right here, so I'm just using my ironing board to give you a quick demonstration. I'm going to lay out my quilt batting. I've just tossed this batting out in my dryer with a really wet face cloth or towel so that it takes all the wrinkles out of my batting and it's nice and fluffy again. Now I have all these squares of Misty Fuse. I'm going to lay out those squares of Misty Fuse every 3 to 4 inches. So just take them and methodically go through and lay out the Misty Fuse pieces on your batting. And you're going to cover your entire batting this way. So if you've got long strips, you can just take that strip and you can rip it like this. You don't necessarily have to cut it in squares. You can use pieces that are slightly bigger, and that's all good. You're just using your leftover Misty Fuse pieces to do this process. I'm now going to take the backing and I'm going to find a corner and match it up with a corner of the batting. And I want to just make sure that I just drop this down on top of that batting. And now I'm going to smooth it out. Do you see why you want the whole thing to be out flat? We need to be able to smooth out this backing so it's completely flat. If we do it in small sections, we're probably going to get some lumps. So I like to do this either on the floor or you're going to do it up on a table. But make sure you can give that surface a little bit of heat. You don't need to heat this a lot, just to get it tacked down. Once you tack it all in place with a little bit of heat from your iron, and you're going to smooth from the center out, you're adhering that Misty Fuse to the backing, and you're adhering that batting and the backing together. Now we don't like to use polyester battings normally because this heating process is going to melt or compact your batting, so it's not going to stay as puffy as you want it. That's why the wool batting or the cotton batting is really preferred, because it does not react to the heat to melt or to become compacted. After you get your batting and your backing laid out flat, you're going to turn that over. We're going to lay that piece out flat all the way across your table. Give it a really good smooth from the center out. We're going to do the same process to the batting and the quilt top. We're going to take our Misty Fuse and we're either going to rip or cut little segments of Misty Fuse to cover that batting every 2 to 3 inches or 3 to 4 inches. It really doesn't matter, but you want to have a system. It's hard to see the Misty Fuse on the batting, although it is shiny. I'm able to see it if I look at an angle here. Make sure there's no threads on your batting. And now we're going to take our quilt top. Now we're going in about 4 inches from each edge. We don't need the edges to match up exactly. We want to have a little excess batting and backing on the outside of this quilt top. Now when I do this whole quilt on a nice big table, I make sure that everything is really flat before I press. I make sure all my Misty Fuse is tucked up under the edges, and then I'm going to do one more step before I press. I'm going to use my biggest square ruler right along the edge of my quilt and make sure that I have 90-degree corners on my quilt before pressing. If your quilt is not square now, it's not going to hang straight. Make sure your quilt is completely square before you do your heating to baste the layers together with Misty Fuse. Marking the lines on my quilt, I have several different options for marking tools. On a white quilt like this one, the blue water erase marker works perfectly well. This is the washable Wonder marker, and it makes a bright blue mark on your fabric, and it's removed with plain water. Another option for marking is your Hera marker, and so I'll be showing you that as well. Place the tool where we want it to go. Use the Hera marker to score a line over it, just like we did when we were marking on that white fabric initially. Now we have a quilting line instead of a placement line. Once you quilt over that line, you're never going to see it. So the hero marker is my absolute favorite tool, but I knew you weren't going to be able to see that, and it's hard to see when you're quilting. So if you have really good eyes, this is a great tool. If you don't, go ahead and use the Blue Wonder marker. For the back of this quilt, I used the Gradations fabric. And I took 2 widths of the gradation fabric, and there's a seam right here. So I put my 2 pinks together, then I have my yellow, green, and blue. Now there's a darker blue and a purple, and they're missing. That was too wide when I put the 2 40-inch widths of fabric together. It was way too wide. So now I have that dark blue and purple left over to use in another project. I used the thread from the kit in the bobbin when I'm quilting. Because I have such a widely varied fabric on the back of the quilt, I use the variegated thread in my bobbin, and it doesn't really show all that much on all these different colors. Of course, you don't have to do your own machine quilting. You could pay a professional to do this for you. But I do think that this is a wonderful opportunity to learn how to do your own machine quilting with the walking foot on your sewing machine, and you get more use out of your Leaves Galore tool by marking your quilting design with the Leaves Galore tool. So I'm going to walk you through this design on the quilt using the Petite Leaves Galore tool that we use for cutting all the shapes in this quilt. This lemon-shaped leaf right here in this pretty little curved diamond is the 2.5-inch side of our tool. We're using the 2.5-inch side of our tool right down the center of this block. So we already have crosshairs right here where the 4 blocks went together. There is a cross right down the center of that curved diamond. We're going to be using this solid line right here, the first solid line in away from the 2.5-inch edge. If you look at that curved edge on the 2.5-inch leaf, it sits right on that solid line. That solid line here is going to follow the seam lines in our quilt. So we're placing that solid line right over the seam lines. We're placing the A. The A is the very center of the tool. It's the deepest depression in this 2.5-inch curve. We're putting that A right on that seam line as well. So the A is lined up with the seam line, and the solid line here, 2.5, right along the 2.5-inch curve, that solid line is placed right along that seam line. And we're going to mark from A to A. So the deepest depression here, come up to the deepest depression here, up and around to the deepest depression here. So we're marking 2 humps just like that. Now we're going to turn our tool and we're going to do the same thing this way. We're starting at the A here. There's an A in the middle. There's an A up here that all fall on the seam line. That solid line falls right on the seam line, and we're going to mark from A to A. We're going to continue rotating around to do that 4 times, and that's going to make that pretty little lemon-shaped leaf in the center of our curved diamond. The second line that I've marked is an echo. I'm going from the 5-inch melon. I'm going to walk that tool up to the very tip of this leaf. So at the tip, I'm going to stop and I'm going to mark this arc with my tool. Now I'm going to turn over to this one. I don't have a leaf right here to go by, so I'm going to make sure that this distance here and this distance here are about the same. If you sit this number 5 right on top of the melon, so that 5 is completely on the melon, That's a great place to use as a reference point. So the 5 is sitting right on this melon, but here I have a leaf to worry about. So I'm going to put my A right on that leaf and draw my arc. I'm going to use my pen now just as a pointer. When we do the quilting around these rings, there's a lot of twisting and turning inside your sewing machine. So there are some better ways to tackle these rings when they're stacked one on top of the other. If they were isolated, you would need to do this entire outside ring and then come inside and do the entire inside ring. Then you're going to come inside and do your flower. If, however, you have rings stuck one on top of the other, you might find a better path with less starting and stopping. For example, I started up here and I went around the outside of the ring to here and then the outside of this ring to here. Then I chose the outside of this ring, came all the way around, and then I reversed my S pattern. So can you see that? I created an S pattern here, went all the way around this ring, and finished up with an S pattern this way. That brought me up to here, and now I need to get to the inside of my ring. So I'm repeating my stitching, putting one set of stitching right over the other to get to the inside. Now on the inside, I can do the same thing, but now I have to travel from the inside of this ring to the inside of this ring. So I'm here, I'm going to repeat my stitching, and then I'm going to travel around the inside of this ring, repeat my stitching, travel the inside of this ring all the way back up to the top. Now I like to repeat my stitching and travel over here. That way I'm not repeating the stitching in the same place every time. So think about the path that you want to follow to get to the inside arcs. Now I'm going to come over here and repeat and then go around these inside arcs. It is a nice way to travel all the way across your quilt and back, so there is less twisting and turning of the quilt, and it takes less time when you don't have to twist and turn that quilt. And I'll show you why when we do this segment here. This one is going to be done one ring at a time, so we are going to be twisting and turning the quilt, and I'll show you this path as I sew that for you with the walking foot on my sewing machine. We're ready to do some machine quilting. So I have the walking foot engaged on my machine. If you don't have an integrated walking foot on your machine, you can buy a separate attachment that is a walking foot. Now just like when I'm buttonhole stitching, I'm going to pull my threads up to the top of my work before I get started. I'm going to lock my threads in place using the locking stitch on my machine, or you can reduce your stitch length to 0 and do 3 stitches right in place. Now you're ready to go off in sewing. Now before I get too far, I'm going to pull away those threads and I'm going to clip off that thread. Now I'm just going to follow along my marked lines, and the walking foot keeps the fullness of the fabric from being pushed forward. So I'm going to stitch right up until my previous stitching, which was done in the ditch. And now I'm going to twist and turn. On these rings where I'm repeating that ring shape, I'm going to have to twist and turn with every single movement or every single section on this ring. And that's a little bit difficult to do. And one of the reasons to get really good at free motion stitching. With free motion stitching, you don't have to twist and turn. But with the walking foot, you do, because the walking foot is, the fabric is being guided by that walking foot. And you have to have your quilt going in the right direction. So I really do prefer to free motion quilt But when you have these long, graceful arcs, I never can seem to get my stitching consistent. So the walking foot is a better choice for these long, graceful curves. Now, if you see a little bunching happening, you can push that fabric into the machine to even it out, especially where you have lines of stitching crossing one another. You might need to even those out and push the fullness up under that foot. It doesn't often happen, but remember, I have polyester batting here, so everything that I'm doing is going to be exaggerated by that polyester batting. The cotton batting is going to do a lot better job staying flat and reducing the puffiness as you have lines of stitching that are crossing one another. But if you see that it's a little full, then you can just put your fingers on both sides, stretch that fabric out, and guide it under your needle so that you have nice distribution of that fullness all the way across your quilt, and you're not going to get puckers. Now with the walking foot, you generally don't get puckers. But you know, you just want to be aware that that can happen, and every machine is different as well. So I'm just stretching that fabric as it goes under the needle side to side, and that's going to even out any fullness. So quilting is no more difficult than any other sewing. You just have to learn some tricks. Now this twisting and turning is the most difficult part. You want to make sure that the fabric that's under the needle, where am I going next? Yes, the fabric that's under the needle is nice and flat. Doesn't matter what it looks like over here or over here, but just the next inch or two in front of that needle needs to be flat. I like to have 5 or 6 inches that are flat, so I don't have to work quite so hard. So just fluff, take the weight off of the quilt so it's not pulling anywhere, so the quilt can move freely as the feed dogs pull that quilt forward. Fluff in front of the needle, keep repositioning to keep all of your weight off of the quilt. If you have your quilt dragging that, so those feed dogs can't grab and pull the fabric through, if you have a lot of drag on the quilt just from the weight of the quilt, you're not going to get consistent size stitches. Another tip is to keep your needle in the down position. Whenever you finish stitching, your needle is automatically down so that you can pivot and keep on sewing. Now the area to my left here is where I removed the fabric marking pen. And you can see it's come back a little bit here and here, so we're going to need to spray that one more time. A lot of quilters just immerse the whole quilt when they're done. Most people say it's not a quilt until you've washed it. But for a wall hanging like this, I could go either way. If I spray it and use a little pinch of baking soda in my water, I'm going to be able to get those blue marks out without soaking the entire quilt. So that may be preferable for a small quilt. It's totally up to you. Whatever makes you happy, as long as you don't see those blue marks coming back, or keep spraying it if you do. So each of these rounds is going to take you a good 20 to 30 minutes because we have to be so careful when we're quilting not to get any puckers, to do a lot of fluffing and moving. So it is a little bit time consuming, but when you think about what it costs to get a machine quilted, you'll realize that it's worth your time. Save a little bit of money by doing it yourself, and have the satisfaction of knowing that you did it all. Now that's a personal preference. Many of us do not mind at all having a professional do our quilts and bringing that professional level of quilting to really enhance these gorgeous applique quilts. After you've had some experience, you can do a wonderful job as well, but it takes time and it takes some projects to work on. So this is a great project to get started with machine quilting. It's a fairly easy project to work with because of the size. And it's really enjoyable to just sit and follow these lines, no thinking required. You can put on Netflix or a movie or a book on an audiobook while you're sewing and get a whole lot done and enjoy that time as well. So I think I've got just 2 more arcs to go in this section. Okay, so now I've come to the very end and I'm just going to bury my threads here. I'm going to take a couple of stitches to get away from the intersection, and then I'm going to do those 3 stitches right in place. I'm going to use my thread snippers right on my machine to cut that thread because I've locked those stitches in place. Now I've finished this entire ring. These rings take a little while to complete, but you can see once it's done and you only have 9 of them to do, it's not going to take you that long. It really gives you some depth and some definition in that quilting. But if you want to come back in and fill in these areas with some stippling or some swirls, some free motion quilting, that would be a great idea. Now those rings are a little bit of a pain in the neck because you do have to twist and turn your quilt. This section in here, same thing. There's a lot of twisting and turning around your flowers. So with the flowers, I actually switched to free motion quilting and found it much easier. When your quilting is completely finished, you're going to just take a spray bottle with some water, a little bit of baking soda, and you're going to spray those blue areas. Now you might want to blot that a little bit so that there's not a big puddle of water on it. So if you have just a little paper towel or a piece of just clean white cotton, you can go ahead and blot that. I don't like to have a lot of water sitting on my quilt. So once again, if anything bleeds, that's going to cause that fabric to bleed. But we've done a great job of pre-washing our fabric, so I'm not anticipating that bleeding. The purpose of the baking soda is to adjust the pH in your water so that it removes the lines the first time and they don't come back.